Are we close enough? How active is that one? Let me know. Okay. Welcome to the Ellensburg City Council meeting of Tuesday, September 6th. Our first event is the study session. And we're going to talk about the downtown parking plan and also the community garden relocation. I'm going to try and divide our time evenly between those two topics. So I guess Heidi, take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, council. And I would recommend we do about 30 minutes on this and then about 20 minutes on the community garden discussion. So I am privileged to be here tonight. I have one person from our team presenting tonight, Jim Weed, and Derek Mayo is not able to join us. And so we'll kind of do a fill in for him. So this is really a discussion that's our intent is to bring you up to date on the activities that have been happening behind the scenes, looking at the 2019 parking plan. This item came up several times as we look at making some improvements downtown with Unity Park, when we had discussions about Pearl Street, and really reinvesting in our downtown, making sure that we're setting ourselves up for future success. So at a meeting earlier this year, I believe it was back in May, we were looking at bringing everybody up to speed on the parking plan. So we actually included it in your packet tonight. So everybody has yet another copy of it, and making sure that this is really easily accessible. What we're going to do tonight is go through the activities and some of the discussions that we've had with the parking team, because at that May meeting, council said, let's create a parking team, have you all go through and make some recommendations and look at what we implement. So we have selected from the matrix in the back of the plan some of our favorite sort of low-hanging fruit and priorities. And we'll update you on those and ask for some specific direction on a few of those items. So members of the parking team, we tried to have some representative from the Downtown Association. We wanted residential developers represented, folks from the EDA, and also just businesses, different types of businesses. And we also wanted to keep it small so it's manageable. And we have actually met 3 times and we conducted a parking count during that time as well. Our goals were really to look at what are some early wins we can do. As we know, our goal is to have Unity Park downtown built next year. We're going to lose some what's become, sort of used parking in that area as that park is built. And so making sure we're maximizing what we have downtown, and then making sure that we have reasonable solutions to kind of, again, mitigate that parking loss. We wanted to understand the trends, because the question that came about as we were looking at the strategy has been, have things changed? Have conditions really changed in our communities? And that's why we went ahead and did a count, and then set ourselves up to measure some ongoing success. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the downtown parking counts, and we actually have kind of a useful, and hopefully this will work. And this is our Arcgis Viewer. And what we did is we wanted to create a simple way to look at our parking counts. Where are people parking? So we have a simple map that was made up. Again, this is our downtown, and I'm assuming that this is can be shared or is still being shared. This is our downtown area. The green is the sort of underutilized areas. The red are the mostly full areas, and the yellow, I think Ben is going to help me here. The yellow, and I'll go back to the other presentations. So it was a way to visualize where are people parking in the downtown. And then it actually creates a system where when we do another parking count, and we did this in early June before the students were out, and then we did just a Thursday and a Saturday. So we actually have it set up so we can take out iPads and do parking counts, and they'll automatically update on this system. So trying to create some efficiency so we can measure the parking behaviors as we go through time. So because what we heard in some of the original parking plan was, well, it's not representative. We missed some lots. And so we have the ability to adjust. This is a dynamic way to track parking. Okay, and I'm going to go back to the presentation here. So that's available to share. There's actually a link in your electronic version of the packet that should link directly to that. Okay, oops, sorry. All right, a couple of the behaviors that we saw identified is when we look at the current parking trends, people are parking more in the downtown area, 3rd Avenue and north. So we're seeing a heavier parking use from 3rd Avenue rather than seeing people park on 2nd and 1st. And some of the questions were, why is that? Oops, sorry. Why is that? And we are seeing, again, some overutilization, not overutilization, some underutilization of some of the private lots. And we have some thoughts about that as we move through here. So the other thing we looked at was citation data. And do you want to talk about that, or do you want me to talk about that? Okay, how about you? And I'll let Captain Weed talk a little bit about the citations we took through.
So we pulled some historical data from our parking citation and warning from the code enforcement folks downtown. We were able to grab some numbers there. So as you can see, during the prior year, 6/13/21 through this year, the highest violation areas were Pearl Street from 2nd to 5th, and also 4th Avenue from Ruby to Water. And that is all representative of our current 3-hour parking regulation that we've had for some time. If you look to, let's see which side. The right side of this graph, I guess, as you look at it, is 2-hour parking. So it is a little bit different representation from 2018 when we had the 2-hour parking before the parking study came out. We did have quite a higher warning rate. So I guess the implication is that have had higher compliance with the 3-hour parking to a degree, and fewer folks violating in those core areas, but it still contains the same information with regard to location, 2nd to 5th on Pearl Street, and then 4th and Ruby to Water Street are the highest violation areas where we have the most violations occurring over time. So that I guess is instructive in terms of utilization.
And a couple things that I'll point out too is again, the 15-minute zones, they tend to be difficult to enforce because our parking code enforcement officers have specific routes that they follow. And then also when we looked at the different types of violations, we found that there's a lot of people parking directly in front of driveways, blocking driveways downtown, and then some loading zones. And so we actually identified through some of these discussions some opportunities to sort of change loading zones and looking at how our parking is really being used or not being used, and being able to make some adjustments as we bring another traffic code revision back to council in the future. So thank you, Captain Reed. So we actually took a look at, the parking team took a look at the matrix, and we went through each matrix. And again, our folks have done some really great homework, and we've had some wonderful conversations over the last few months. And we looked at picking out some of what we thought were some of the priority areas. And so you'll see this in a grid. Some of our actions that we've either done in the past or have taken and have looked at during the last few months, and maybe some strategies or some gaps or some needs as we move forward. So one of the strategies that was outlined, and again, these are following the same matrix. A1 was to continue to explore options to modify on-street parking. As Captain Weed mentioned, one of the first changes that council made after the study came out was to go from 2-hour parking to 3-hour parking. And we saw that did make a difference in the citations. We're still doing probably higher levels of warning, but that means people are complying more over time. So And then we've done this, made changes by request or when we've done construction too. So there has been some movement on these, but nothing terribly significant over time, other than the change in from 2 to 3 hours. The other thing is that we don't really have an EV strategy. That's one of the things that came up a few different times, and you'll see it talked about here, and I'll come back to that. Shared parking agreements was something that people have talked about a while as sort of some of the low hanging fruit. So we actually looked at other cities and looked at the models. What do other cities have in place for shared parking agreements? The idea would be to take some of the private lots we have in downtown and either reserve some of the spaces for public use. And talking to some of the current businesses, what we understand is there might be some interest in doing this in exchange for maintenance or in exchange for some sort of payment, because these private businesses are building parking specifically for their customers. In our downtown CC zone, we do not require businesses to create parking. And so looking for how to compensate those businesses. Our group also put together a list that we identified of potentially underused parking areas. And before we had discussions with those businesses, we wanted to talk to you about what's the direction we want to go. And part of what came out of our discussion too was talking about maybe a matchmaking service rather than the city being the intervening party to say, let's make this and see if we have private businesses that would work with us on creating public spaces. If there's a need for either residential developers that need spaces, parking spaces, 24-hour spaces for their tenants, or are there businesses that need longer term parking for their employees? And maybe there's a role for the EDA to play matchmaker in this group. And so one of the things we knew is more discussion is necessary here. We also need to know what is the need and what is the interest of participating in something like that. So exploring parking permits was B3, and that was really about, we have a residential representative of residential developer who actually builds parking for their tenants. And so one of the thoughts was, again, kind of back to the matchmaking, maybe there's an opportunity for landlords to purchase a parking pass for their tenants and sort of or create some sort of bank system. So again, trying to really maximize the current spaces we have utilized or trying to match people with underutilized spaces rather than, again, the city intervening and creating that public sector input. So tracking and monitoring citation data, we've done a little bit of that, and we'll look at that over the times. I thought something was interesting is that there's a Fourth Circuit decision about chalking systems and that being intrusive. And so that is a system that we use. There are other systems that you can do, but there are some challenges with GPSing and other again, citation or code compliance monitoring devices. So really it's been some fascinating information and conversation. Downtown wayfinding signs. We don't have a budget for this, but we believe that we can accommodate this through our current sign program. So 2 of our members are actually working on some consistent signage. It likely won't be Ellensburg specific. It will be very clear signage. We need a better wayfinding system downtown, especially for parking. In your packet as well, you'll see that the EDA has put together, they call it a tourist map. So they've identified the public parking spots. We explored options because we live in a world of technology and we do a whole lot from our phones. So looking at what kind of apps are available, what we're missing, if we wanted to have, we could put our parking map on, so we could identify public parking areas on an app or a map. But if we were to have an app that provided, here's a free space, so notifying people if they were looking for parking that there's an open space over here, it actually requires something like a meter, and we don't have parking meters. But that was some of the discussion from our parking team. They wondered, is the city open to a parking metering program, because that would help with locations. We also heard some frustration. Sometimes people want to park longer than 3 hours. So having some sort of pay to play program might be of interest. But again, that's a policy decision on a council level that we haven't discussed and that the plan really doesn't discuss either. So something to kind of keep on the radar, and we can circle back to that. Partnering with private organizations to maximize lots. This is sort of a repetition from one of the previous previous items. And then F1 was support the employers and property managers with transportation and parking information. And this is something that one of our members is working with the EDA on, is making sure that we have packets for businesses and making sure that we can identify spaces for businesses, and really trying to sell that to the businesses by saying, you want your customers to be able to park out front. You want to make it appealing. And so making sure that we're connecting people with the information so they can start directing their employees to other locations. And then again, coordinating once again with the downtown businesses about new information and creating some packets information about helping people understand where they can park and where the different parking zones are. Oops. And then, sorry. Zoning changes for parking. And again, remember that we all, as council, you have the ability to change code and change the rules essentially. And remember, in your CC zone, we don't require people to invest in parking when they're bringing their business in. And so, that is a policy decision. And down the road, if there was a policy need, the council could make an adjustment. But that was just one of our discussions. It's not really a recommendation at this point. So some other ideas that were generated through our discussion was the really sort of the futuristic need to, these are maybe outside, but I think they deserve a little nod. And that's creating some sort of bridge between CWU and the downtown. There's still some desire in the community to make sure that there's a really clear sort of welcome path. I think that's been a discussion with the creative arts programs and district, thinking about creating that bridge and physically and one of the things that we talked about was that some cities and some universities are doing like driverless cars, and they're making it really easy for people to get from one part of town, especially campus, to the other. So I think just exploring some creative ideas with CWU is an opportunity to be out there. We talked about changing values, and this is really where some cities are doing priority parking for trying to encourage. We know that electric vehicles are here and they're probably on their way up. More usage. We have multifamilies units that we have kids showing up to school and they have an EV charger and there's no place to plug in their EV. So we know our infrastructure, we need more of these. And so really thinking about, do you create priority parking or do we create simply more EV charging spots? And it doesn't have to be the city creating these necessarily. We can make it something that we can partner to create. So exploring that. One of the recommendations in the parking strategy was also to look at bicycle parking. And as our team said, we have made it pretty significant investment in bicycle infrastructure downtown. It looks great. Everybody was very happy with it. So we didn't think we needed anything with that. And shuttling from hotels for big events is something council discussed. That's one of our parking team members is actually working on that, starting to work with some of the businesses that host things and some of the event organizers and starting to create some maps as well. And then again, the discussion about, is there interest in adding metered parking? There are smart meters. Again, opportunities to sort of maximize technology and help people navigate. And there is a mechanism out there. It's called a public benefit improvement area that some downtowns have that actually create sort of a public benefit. It's a parking benefit area. And so if they do a metering system, it's all of those funds go into investing in improving that development area. So it is a mechanism out there that if council were to consider at a later date making different investments, we could certainly explore that. And then there's discussion about residential units doing some sort of, we talked about the parking bank that folks who have residences downtown that maybe they pay a permit to park and get a 24-hour pass. So creating more flexibility, but also it's some income to help fund parking. And then the relocation of the skate park. I think that's been an ongoing discussion. So I'm gonna broach that here. So just at a conceptual level, I think this has come up since I've been here and hearing in the community as an opportunity or potentially a need. And I had our engineers take the skate park area. And again, we currently do have parking on the south side and a little parking on the north side. And if they took the layout and said, what if we made this all parking? What could we get? And essentially the net benefit was about 25 additional spaces could go on this. And that would be with, removal of the skate park equipment and or relocation of the skate park equipment or relocation of the skate park. In addition to that, there would be 4 to 5 spaces on the south side of Unity Park. And we know that there are about 23, depends on how people park, if they're parking legally or not. There are 23 plus spaces within the Unity Park area that did not really exist all as public parking until the last few years, until that belonged to the city. So the net gain would essentially be like 28, 29 spaces from really converting the skate park. So deserves some attention. And I guess one of my questions is that of interest to explore with council? We also had the staff toss that out. And if we did minimal improvements, the range would essentially be somewhere from $50,000 to about $200,000. And so, which again, we could explore funding sources for. So the other piece we talked about is in some of the questions we need more information. We don't know, there's something that came up as we were doing the parking counts and looking at the utilization of parking north of 3rd Avenue. And there's a lack. It's some people say it feels more like residential, so people don't want to park sort of south and down to 1st. But again, remember our parking area is essentially from 1st to 6th and Water to Ruby. And so we looked at, what is the perception? Because people, I heard anecdotally that people don't feel safe. And some people say it's the skate park or it's, kids hanging around and it would be great to test that and to get more information about people's perception of safety or what their perception is. And so why they do choose some of the parking behaviors. And then again, the issue of what is the need? What data do we have? Can we get some data on what is the interest and need for residential parking and also for employee needs? And then again, our goal is to continue to measure our parking practices, looking at over time. Generally, we believe the numbers, we saw more parking utilization in our downtown area than was measured in the 2019 study. So we're seeing an uptick. And as folks remember, I love this quote, that if we don't have a downtown problem, or if we don't have a parking problem, we have a downtown problem. And so, this is a good problem to have, but it also, we said we're going to work on this. And so here's sort of our first broach on, these are the things that we think are important to work on. So that's enough of me talking. My questions to council is, are there issues identified or that we didn't look at that are important to you? Are you supportive of the direction we're heading with the parking team? Or are there other priorities? And then what is the interest in the skate park discussion?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Questions. I can go last first, I guess. Skate park have the cost that you out there was for developing the parking lot, I assume, does not include the cost of relocating the skate park. So I guess I think it would be a worthy item for consideration, but I guess the question is, have there been any discussions with Parks and Rec Commission or the department about possible locations, or is it just that we'll find a place where it can be?
So this is the beginning of a discussion. It's going to start with you here, and we'll take this out to Parks and Rec. There's a group that's been talking about wanting a new skate park. It is part of the Kiwanis Park master plan. And we don't have identified funding for that. So you are correct. This amount does not include relocation of. So that would be additional discussions with neighborhoods, discussions with Parks and Rec Commission moving forward.
Yeah, I knew it was early days. So
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with the conclusion of bicycle parking, but I do have, I guess I'm curious about, my recollection is I don't use the bicycle parking for my bike when I carry it up to my office up the stairs because I don't want to leave it on the street for various reasons. But it occurs to me that, and I could be wrong, but it seems like most of our bicycle parking, the racks are on sidewalks. And I'm not talking about capacity, but we're kind of at cross purposes because we have a real problem with people riding bicycles on sidewalks. And this has been an issue that's been kicked down the road for a long time. We've made no progress on it. So I wonder if the way we design our bicycle parking needs to be rethought, because we're telling people, keep your bikes off the sidewalks, at least for the 2 or 3 signs that are still out there that say no wheels on the sidewalks. But then we're saying, put your bike on the sidewalk to park it. So I think I'd be interested in, and I don't know if it's worth taking vehicle spaces offline to accommodate bicycles the way we do motorcycles, but I just put that out there because, yeah, I think in raw numbers, we probably have enough slots in the bike racks, but we've got a problem that we haven't addressed. So I just think it's an ongoing problem. And it really goes against feeling safe walking down town. And it's not just bikes, but it includes bikes.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, just one. So with the Unity Park design, there's those drive inlets. Are we accounting for those to be turned into parking spots when we're talking about removing the 23 spots from that area? Are we
Well-
subtracting the 8 or so that we're gonna be putting in because of those 2 driveways?
So I'm adding in, so the net, yes, it was including, when we remove those driveways, that will create additional diagonal parking on the south side, correct? And then our estimates, I've heard anywhere between 27 and 23 spots in Unity Park. It depends on how people park and where, how many, again, sort of legal spots. And I think we're more toward the 23. So it would be a net positive, 1 to 6 or 7 spaces.
Were there specific conversations with potential private partnerships? Have any of those evolved? or
We
gone
came
anywhere?
here
Oh,
first
okay.
because at this point, we don't have a budget for creating an ongoing parking agreement to say we want this downtown. We're starting here with council first. And then again, if there's interest in moving forward, again, it is and what is the second part of that question is what is the city's role? Is the city, the matchmaker and the one who is, helping create that partnership for public parking in private lots? Or is it a private to private arrangement that we can help maybe broker?
Well, regarding the skate park relocation, I guess so long as it's being relocated and it is part of the master plan already, that feels like the natural next step. But I think the communication around that would need to be really clear to the families and the users of the skate park.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Nancy.
I know that I'm sure that you all are considering the number of handicap parking spaces especially as Unity Park is developed. So I'm not going to say anything about that except that. It occurred to me when you were talking about the partnerships, is there any potential to speak with ESD about Morgan Middle School parking lot? Or possible use for city parking after hours? I mean, and they could design some kind of mechanism to block that when they're having night events at school. That's a very large parking lot.
Councilmember Goodlow, would you speak into the microphone?
I thought I was.
You lean back.
It's true. He just doesn't like me. Oh, the recommendation was maybe pursue discussion with school district about the use of Morgan Middle School.
Great idea.
Your yellow card, not mine. Just put our sweep that out.
Sure, one more.
Quick follow-up, on the bullet under the other items, the residential unit purchasing parking passes. We've talked about this for a long time, sort of along the lines of the RPZs, the zones that we have kind of more north toward campus. But was there what caught my eye was for certain spaces or lots, and I guess if you can get an off-street lot, that would be good. But it seems to me that if maybe a more efficient way to manage that would be to just issue a permit and say with that RPZ permit, you could park in the 3 hours and without any limitation or something. but I wondered if the conversation, if there was purpose behind the specific location or certain spaces or lots.
I think part of the discussion was trying to reserve the fronts of businesses for customers as much as possible. And so if we have sort of open access to all the 3-hour spots, you might be limiting that to some degree.
Continue to hear complaints, at least from one business, that people don't have their employees park in front of their businesses, they have them park in front of other people's businesses. And they're not this particular business, is not a big fan of 3-hour parking. So, which, I mean, we've reduced citations, but that hasn't necessarily fixed the problem for some of the merchants who need the higher turnover. And I don't know if selectively we could go to 2-hour on certain blocks that are have a higher level of citations, just to try and disperse folks out, or some other strategy, but we are at 6:30. So unless anyone else has a burning comment, question, it's time to move on.
Excellent. Thank you, council. And I'm actually going to relocate to my seat so I can have my notes in front of me.
So our next topic is the community garden relocation discussion.
So once again, Heidi Baron Cernaway, your city manager. I have just a brief overview of the community garden discussion, and our Parks and Recreation Director is online here to join in. And just to provide a little bit of background, we are here today talking about relocation because over the last couple of years, we've taken some actions and promised some groups that we'd have some discussion about relocating the current community garden. So as a reminder, we purchased that piece of property on First and Pine many years ago for excess parking for Hell Homes and the library. Council made a decision several years ago to surplus that for affordable housing, and it went through a number of processes. And I will just back up. That was in 2018 was the first action on there. 2017 was the first action on that. In 2013, a group of active folks in the community saw this empty piece of property and they said, can we create a community garden here? And the city said, okay. It was initially a contract with Elmview that transitioned to a contract with Fish for, I believe it was $1 a year to lease the property. And it was a number of volunteers that essentially built the community garden program. And it was sort of overseen by Elmview and Fish, but really run by a number of volunteers, primarily in that central area in our downtown community. And these folks have been very active as we were in the process of surplusing that property last fall. They said, would you please consider having discussions? And we said, yes. We actually reserved $10,000 in the budget for this year for relocation costs. And we knew that we would have this conversation moving forward because this last month, we actually signed the agreement with Stalder Interests to build some affordable housing. So we gave notice to Fish and the gardeners that this is the last season. So we have an October 31st sort of deadline. And so we wanted to make sure we're having this discussion about what are our other options. So Parks Director Case and myself sat down with a number of the sort of active community voices, and it was Sarah Haven and Reed Waite, who I believe you heard from. And then we had some other communications with Karen Stansberry and Rebecca Sandvig. And one of the gardeners, Jose, and I believe his wife's name was Marta, also came to visit and told us some very personal stories. These are, again, the program has been up for 9 years at this point. And so folks have become pretty attached to gardening. And I would just remind folks that when we talk about food security, this is a very typical role for cities to play in food security, is providing space for community gardens and support for programs. So very much in line, again, with what other communities do. We've also gotten some notice that there's a Rotary Club and actually maybe several that are interested in doing pollinator gardens. And so there's sort of a broader interest in gardening in the community as well. So the costs, again, we have the $10,000. The city actually pays for irrigation costs, and gardeners pay for essentially $10 per box per year. And I think that's sort of loosely organized or enforced. So Director Case and I talked about the interests with folks, and they really would like, something that's still accessible to downtown. We met with a number of folks who drive there, but also folks who walk there, and really appreciate that. And we looked at what our parks inventory was. It's pretty typical to have, not just one place in a community, sometimes several places. There are some private. So there's, I believe, St. Andrews, one of the faith communities, has their own community garden program. Central Washington University has one. And I believe Fish at one point has talked about putting at least farming or gardening up on their facility on the airport property. So having something closer to our downtown really does make sense. So I would actually just turn it over to Director Case to talk about, he might have some photos to share with us too, to talk about some options that we have.
Sure. Thank you, City Manager. Hopefully you can see what I'm sharing right now. So yeah, I mean, obviously, parks are an ideal, or a location that can be utilized for community gardens. The infrastructure is still there. We have water, we have parking, oftentimes we have bathrooms, storage facilities, so it's power. So it's kind of a logical jump to look at parks. The other thing that we really want to do, and what was identified in our 2016 park plan, was taking underutilized park spaces and turning them into places of higher use and greater community benefit and gain. And obviously that's the purpose behind park facilities. And we've seen that success in our park facilities since 2016, where we've gone in and we've taken underutilized spaces like out at Irene Reinhardt, and we turned it into a disc golf course and off-leash dog park. West Ellensburg Park right now, if you go out there on a Saturday morning or any morning where the temperature is above 70 degrees, you're going to find probably 25 to 35 people playing pickleball every morning, where 5 years ago that wasn't happening. So I think community gardens can help serve that purpose. A little different type of recreation, maybe than what jumps to mind, but I think it can still provide that valuable service to our community. So I think when we think community gardens, oftentimes we think kind of locally and in terms of what we have here, and really that's kind of the focus, coming from a visual standpoint. And as the city manager mentioned, city park facilities across the state. City of Seattle has, I think, 89 different parking P patches in their public properties, most of which are in city park facilities. So if we look at parks as a possible location, we would want to look at doing something a little bit different than probably what we have at our current downtown community garden, just in terms of kind of the look and the aesthetic of things. Here are just a couple of examples of different community gardens and kind of their general look and what they have to offer. And so we want it to be an appealing place to come to. We don't want it to have an impact on the surrounding neighborhood, any type of negative impact, or even any type of negative impact on the specific park itself and the types of uses that we see there. So here are just a couple smatterings of different examples. This is actually in the city of Seattle at one of their, I think it's a public parking garages. They turned it into a community garden over COVID because people weren't driving to work. And so they took a space that wasn't being utilized, and on top of a concrete jungle, they were able to create a vibrant public space. And so I think when we're looking locally here, kind of expanding our horizons and really thinking, outside of just, a turfed area or a vegetated area, and really thinking about the different opportunities that we have, maybe under public ownership, that at first blush wouldn't seem like a viable place for a community garden. So I guess, a couple, one park facility that comes to mind immediately is Whipple Park over in West Ellensburg. Whipple has been around for many generations, and it was the first park in the West Ellensburg neighborhood. Since that time, West Ellensburg has become kind of the hotbed of recreational facilities in our community, with the addition of West Ellensburg Park in the 70s and 80s, and then Rotary Park, Irene Reinhardt Park, and the Reeser Creek floodplain restoration area as well. So we have literally hundreds of acres of public space and recreation ground in West Ellensburg. Whereas, Whipple now doesn't serve the role that it did when it was first dedicated to the city by the Whipple family. Typically what we see at Whipple Park is along the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a split rail fence there. Just outside of that, we have a gravel parking area. And if you drive by there at the lunch hour, you will typically see, at least one car there, sometimes two, sometimes three. And they're just there eating their lunch and grabbing a bite or reading a book. But the actual park itself isn't real heavily utilized by the surrounding neighbors. There is a small basketball court over in the corner. We do have some people that utilize that on occasion, but certainly this is a park that is underutilized, and with the potential of addition of a community garden, it could really regenerate and kind of revitalize that space. To give you kind of an idea, the area circled in yellow, that is Whipple Park. The area in the box, that is the existing community garden downtown. And so it's just about a little less than a mile if you take the roads from the current park to what would be a new facility over at Whipple. And so it's kind of in the ballpark. For some, this would be kind of a deterrent or a negative, that being that far away. But when you're really looking at public spaces and public spaces that can support this type of activity, we talked real briefly about Veterans Memorial Park over at the pool. Obviously we're just coming off of Fair and Rodeo, and so there's some limitations on what space could be used. But we could probably identify some pockets in that park that are underutilized. However, you have large trees growing adjacent to that may significantly impact the ability to get sunlight to a community garden. And so it has to work on a lot of different levels. And so I think, if we're creative and dedicate the time, I think we can come up with some pretty good spots for a community garden within our existing park inventory. And that's really looking just kind of in the downtown core. If we spread out and we look outside of that area, the number of parks and opportunities that we have, grows exponentially as you kind of further your ring outside of the downtown core. So that's what I got for neighborhood parks. I think it makes a lot of sense for the city to look at this, and I think it could be a partnership definitely worth exploring. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you had.
There are questions for Director Case?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Evan.
Have we looked at any possibility of doing any kind of rooftop gardens, or say like these new apartment buildings that are going in, asking them to actually build the top portion with water and power for gardens up there?
So I can answer that. So we are looking for a public space, but I will tell you that at least one of those buildings that was built just a couple of years ago has garden boxes that people in their residence actually adopt and take care of for the year. So some of that's going on privately already.
And what about any kind of a partnership with schools? So that we have those placed all throughout the community. We partnered with them using some of their field that are being underutilized and putting a community garden in those sections might help with the kids and students as well.
So I know that like Fort School District has its own garden and they have lots of programming around that. We have not broached that subject, but certainly is something we can.
Anyone else?
Just a question, an idea while you were talking, has City Hall ever been considered as a potential spot? Is that crazy?
I would suggest the downside of that is when there's big rallies here, for I mean, we want this to be the public square too, but although Unity Park is kind of more that now, or will be, for political rallies and what have you. I have seen some large gatherings on the lawn at City Hall. But, I think that we could consider it in certain.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned that a lot of communities have small spaces in a number of places, and it's
Yeah.
about what power and utility needs do you have and what other uses. Our group and the group of gardeners that came to visit us had identified several places, and some of were several were private underutilized spaces, and we were looking for what do we have control over that we don't have to lease, that we can, again, what public spaces could we consider? But and there are probably other ideas out there. This looked like, again, just sort of a perfect setup that's in a location that's still very accessible to downtown. It would, and as Brad mentioned, it would maximize some of the use of that space too. Sort of met a number of goals.
Well, Whipple Park seems awesome. I was just thinking, in addition to when Brad mentioned having several spaces in several locations in terms of developing the program overall. And I think it's great that we feel that we have the capacity and the community interest for something like this built off of the community's incentive, I guess, or innovation around that space.
One spot I didn't mention, and I should have, we have property up near Mount Stewart Elementary School and Ida, the old BMX facility that we've talked about with the school district on a variety of occasions as potential, land swap or what have you. So as the community continues to grow and you look for areas to expand the program and not infiltrate what's already going on along Willow Street or even north on Alder Street with Central, I think we do have some public spaces that we can expand out and really try to serve the community as a whole and not kind of locate all of our spaces in kind of a tight geographic area.
I agree with the philosophy of scattering them around. And I also, I guess my question would be if this goes from Fish kind of managing it, what kind of operational, what's kind of staff time is going to be required to lease this boxes and I don't know, make sure the water is running and can that just be added to park staff without?
I would suggest that we can talk about operational models and we can look at what does it look like for the city to run, and it might make sense still for Fish to operate the community garden. So I think that's a later discussion, but again, there might be some advantages of each.
Or I guess my thought is if there was a neighbor that would kind of take ownership, that might be best, just because of the oversight in the neighborhood or nearby.
Like the pocket park.
Basically having a manager on site.
Yeah, I know like at St. Andrews, someone who was across the street kind of managed it, and Sarah Haven kind of took the community garden that we had, and she's a neighbor and she could kind of watch what was going on there and communicate it. So just an idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think to make these programs successful, it does take a community effort. And again, having someone with some ownership in it locally as a neighbor is very, very important. So yeah, I think that the group that's working in the community garden right now has done a tremendous job, and I hope that we can continue that.
I do have a question about the public transportation to Whipple Park. Do we do that now? Is Whipple Park on one of our routes? Or?
Yeah, sorry, Heidi, the transit runs along Fifth Avenue. And so it's probably there's a stop about 2 blocks away from where Whipple Park is at. And so it is right up the street and around the corner.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Any further guidance on parking? Where we break before our regular meeting?
Wait a minute, I did have one small question. It was- Okay, actually Captain Weed would answer it better. So the fines for parking
Mhm.
that we issue downtown, where does that fund, it just goes into the general fund or is that set aside?
Currently, they actually go to the county. We have an agreement with the county that runs our municipal court. So all of, and in exchange for doing that, they retain all of the fines and penalties for parking infractions and other violations.
So as we break, I'm noticing some 2x4s in the back of the room, and those are for us to sign. I think sign one of them, don't sign all 6.
You can actually sign all 6.
You
And
can
so
sign,
those
but
are
there
for
were very
6
simple
different
keys.
houses.
No, they're,
For-
they are Habitat for Humanity studs.
Starter studs.
There are
It-
markers.
And so council, just to let you know, there is a water main break right outside City Hall. So City Hall water will be shut off or is probably
is.
now shut off while they make the repairs. And so
Does that mean we can't go to use the?
It means
it's one
use them
flush.
sparingly.
Yes.
Experience.
Okay,
I'm glad I got some water.
I guess so, yeah.
Stop
I'm
drinking
almost
it.
out.